Howdy, howdy. Back at it again. Reviewing free will a little bit and psychological hedonism. Yeah. Alex O'Connor is a pretty good dude. He's a modist, so I kind of disagree with him, but he used to be a utilitarian. Uh, I used to be a utilitarian, so we were basically the same. But I'm a negative utilitarian. I believe there's actually values in the universe, and that there's you know something a little bit more visceral and real going on than just being like boo or yay. But when it comes down to it, his views on free will I feel are pretty accurate. So based.
Okay, well, our speaker today is Alex O'Connor, and Alex is a first-year student at the University of Oxford, reading theology and philosophy. Sorry, they always say reading, don't they, on university chapters rather than studying, but anyway, so that's one of those old-fashioned terms. Alex is an ex-Catholic, he's an atheist, a science enthusiast, and an advocate for secularism. His YouTube channel, which goes by the name of Cosmic Skeptic, has got 250,000 subscribers. You may be one of them. So I'm absolutely delighted that he's agreed to speak to us today with a brand new talk, which will go to video, and no doubt that will be uploaded to his channel, which will give us some publicity as well, as long as he stands in front of the doors at you this side there. So will you please give Alex a very warm welcome.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. Let me just fill out these notes. Yeah, thanks for coming out. It's nice and reassuring to see so many of you here, especially to talk about something that seems to be such a specific issue as ethics. I want to present some philosophical ideas that I haven't really spoken about before, and I hope that I'm essentially hoping that we can get towards or move towards something that resembles objectivity in ethics and determining what we should be doing, how we should be behaving, and how we can make sense of terminology like that. If there's no objective basis for these kind of things, like
Love when he used to care about objective ethics, and now he's just like, "Lol, we're just expressing things," and I'm just like, "Yeah, fuck that. It's definitely not what we're doing. I'm doing more than just expressing things.
in some kind of God or religious
I'm
tradition.
feeling
So I've spoken quite a bit about morality before on my YouTube channel, which, as David said, some of you may be subscribed to, and hopefully all of you will be eventually at the end of this evening. I've spoken about morality before, and I've been very critical of the idea that you can ground it in any kind of objectivity, the idea that you can have, that you can say as a matter of fact that certain things are good or bad, or that you should or shouldn't do them. And I've had conversations with my friend Stephen Woodford, who runs another YouTube channel, and we publicly discussed it, and it's been something that people have just not wanted to stop talking to me about. And Stephen recently came to Oxford, because these conversations that we had got far more attention than I ever would have thought talking about morality. Stephen came to Oxford, and we spoke privately about our ideas, and we've essentially come together at this point, and we now roughly agree. And so I'm hoping to kind of explain where I'm at the moment, hopefully it's a view that Stephen will be able to eventually endorse. But it's changed, essentially, from what I've spoken about in the past. So this is a good opportunity, I'm glad we're filming it, I put it on my channel, and finally people I have updated people. So there are a few steps to this, what I'm going to have to do to convince you, hopefully, or at least open you to the idea that there can be such a thing as objectivity in ethics, or something that resembles it. There are some stages in the arguments, and these might seem totally unrelated, but they're actually really important, and they will come together at the end. The first thing I'm going to have to do, and I'm really sorry for this, but I'm going to have to try and convince you that free will does not exist. I'm going to have to try and convince you that you're not in control of your actions. Now, I wouldn't be surprised to learn that many of you already maybe think that way, or are familiar with philosophy at least, but it's an important part of ethics, and I think people will understand intuitively why that's the case. But once I've done that, I need to point out that since if you are not in control of your actions, as the free will philosophy that I'm espousing states, then we have to determine what is. And what I think is actually determining your actions are your desires, and sort of a psychological determinism going on in that sense. So we have to talk about the nature of desire. And the second thing that I want to convince you of is the idea that desire itself is centered around pleasure and the avoidance of pain. And not only that pleasure is something that's desired, but the pleasure in itself is the only thing that can be desired in itself. This is a very utilitarian case, but I'm going to try not to cross the line of saying that it's necessarily desirable, that you should desire it, just that it's the only thing you desire. And again, this might seem
Avoiding pain is also
arguing,
desirable.
but it will come together at the end. So what I'm essentially hoping to argue is that if you don't have free will, and you are determined by your desires, and you desire a certain specific thing, then whenever you behave, because your behavior is determined by your will, which isn't free and is determined by something else, and we know what that thing is, when you behave, it can be indicative of beliefs that you hold about the natural world, which can either be right or wrong. Now, this may be slightly confusing or odd, but the pieces will come together. Essentially, the reason why I call this talk the good delusion is because traditional notions of ethics, as I see them, don't make any sense when we remove free will from the picture for fairly intuitive reasons. But I think that what we can get to is a system where we don't say that certain actions are good or bad as an objective matter of fact, but that certain actions demonstrate that you as a person have certain beliefs that are either right or wrong as a matter of fact, and it's practically indistinguishable. So to try and avoid confusing anybody any further than I perhaps already have, I think we should just get into things. So I want to try and leave a bit of room for Q&A, because the pieces of the puzzle fit quite trivially together. Once you agree that free will doesn't exist, once you agree with the second part with pleasure, they go together very easily to come to the conclusion. So it's kind of in the concepts themselves that the controversies in our lives. So I want to make sure that we've got time to ask questions about the concepts themselves.
Well, I was on Do Not Watch's live stream on Sunday, I believe. Yeah, I think it was Saturday or Sunday. And I'm guessing the Prophet wanted to talk about free will. We never really got to that. So, watching a video on free will to just kind of like get myself more in tune to the discussion. I mean, I'm already like pretty much fully aware of the concepts of free will, but this is my favorite video about free will. So, because I believe in psychological hedonism. So we're just gonna review it a little bit for the channel.
But we need to go through them. So the first thing is to
subscribe to
mention why
Alex
there is a problem
Connor
with
if
it.
you haven't.
And when it comes back to morality, the big problem is that no one seems to agree. It's a fairly, that's not an amazing observation, but I don't just mean that people don't agree with moral conclusions. People can have agreements about what is right and wrong that have completely different justifications for those things. So there can be two people who both completely agree that murder is wrong, but one person has completely different justification to the other. Somebody might think that it's wrong because God says so. Somebody might think that it's wrong because they're an ethical egoist, and they think that they should act in ways that are good for themselves, and because we live in a social contract, the best thing we can do is be nice to others so that the behavior is reciprocated. Either way, these are massive disagreements, very important philosophical disagreements, but the conclusion is precisely the same. So the important part of this philosophy are not the moral conclusions, but the meta-ethical underlying, the justification for the moral conclusions that we come to. So we need to understand what we actually mean when we talk about good and bad, and should not. And the problem is this is not an easy thing to do. One of the main problems with this is that shoulds exist in an entirely separate category of thought from otherwise familiar natural facts. Famously, David Hume observed that you cannot have premises which talk about the way that things are and get to the way that things ought to be or should be as a matter of logical conclusion. It can't be done. You can say that this is the case, this is the case, this is the case, but you'll never get to a should. If I say to you, it is the case that it's raining outside, therefore you should take an umbrella, it's intuitive, but that's not logically valid. There's a hidden underlying premise there that you should try to avoid getting wet. And Hume's point is that you cannot cross this divide. An important point to note is that this isn't just true of is and ought. Another thing that David Hume is very famous for is the problem of induction. Induction is the process by which we reason from things that we have observed to conclusions about things we have not, including the future. So how do we know that the sun is going to rise tomorrow? Well, David Hume says that we can't. We don't know that the sun's going to rise tomorrow. What we do is we reason from the way that things are and the way that they have been to how they're going to be in the future. But that's, again, not logically valid. We don't know that the sun's going to rise tomorrow because you can't get a will be from an is, just as much as you can't get an ought from an is. So it's a gap that's very difficult to cross, that can't be crossed as a matter of logic. And that poses a big problem for ethics, because I can tell you all the facts you want about the natural world. I can tell you all about the nature of pleasure and the nature of well-being, but it will do nothing for our understanding of how we should behave. So what I'm going to try and do...
Experience has a fundamental value. I mean, logic can show that other people's experience is equal to your own, and that, once you value your own experience, which is fundamental to experience, that you value it. Once you acknowledge that you value your experience, is a better way to put it, that you ought to value other people's experience through logic. But to get even a prime value to begin with, to get the original ought, to found your oughts for other people, you kind of have to have experience and a value derived from that. And I think that does exist, because I fucking directly experienced this value. I can testify to it. I've seen other people testify to it. Most people testify to it. I think most people that testify against it are liars or nihilists and sadists that have an objective. So, but hey.
It's come to a conclusion where we can use meaningful language involving shoulds. Right? We're not going to be able to say that you should do this, you should not do that, and yet not cross the is-ought divide. Stay entirely within the realm of natural facts and scientific, observable, empirical, natural facts. Now, the first step of this, like I say, is free will. So I suppose actually it might be a good idea, perhaps a raise of hands, how many people here, in the traditional sense of the libertarian free will, the idea that you are the author of your actions, you are in control of what you do, how many people here would say that they believe that they have free will? Okay. This is good. This is good. I was terrified that none of you would raise your hand and I'd be massively wasting my time. But it's good to see that a lot of you don't as well, because there's going to be a bit of controversy here, I suppose. So, actually, for those people who raise their hands, could you just put your hand up again? No, just keep your hand up if you don't mind me just asking you a question. Okay, so in the front. You say you have free will, and I know I kind of defined it when I asked the question, but what do you understand by free will? What do you think that means? When you say you have free will, what do you mean by free will?
So I think that I can choose what I do, or I don't really what I want to do.
Okay, so you can choose what you can do, but you can't choose what you want to do.
I can choose not to do things I want to do.
Okay, so you can want to do something, but then choose not to do it, regardless. So you can't control what your desires are, but if you desire to do something, you can still choose not to do it. Okay, that's a general, that's a fairly, is that agreeable to people? Does anybody have a, okay, so this is really important, and that's a fantastic distinction to make.
Bye.
Because free will comes down to the nature of desires, and whether or not we can actually act in accordance with out of accordance with our desires. Now, as you rightly pointed out, you can't control what your desires are themselves. Now, the first step in the free will argument is to recognize that everything that you will ever do as a matter of conscious action. So I'm not talking about unconscious actions like rolling out of bed when you're asleep, because nobody would consider that in the realm of free will anyway. I'm talking about the actions that people would generally consider to be free. So whatever conscious action you make, you'll only ever do it because you desire to. This is the argument that I'm going to have to make. Now, we have a point here that you can desire things that you then, in fact, do not do. And this is one of the most important objections that you get to the free will argument. Because essentially, if you admit that you cannot control what you desire, and you then admit that everything you do is because you desire it, then you essentially logically led to the conclusion that you don't control what you do. I mean, I hope people would generally agree with that. If I can demonstrate to you why it is that you actually have to act in accordance with your desires, and also it's the case that you can't control your desires, then perhaps some people would be more sympathetic to the idea that in fact you can't control your actions. So it seems that the sticking point is going to be this nature of desire. Now, what does it mean to desire to do something? That's a difficult question. But when we're talking about an instance where you desire to do something and yet you don't, have to give me an example of something an example of desiring to do something and yet still not doing it.
Sleeping in when you should go to work.
Okay, sleeping in when you should go to work. So you wake up in the morning and you sleep in, and you know that you should go to work, and you want to go to work, you still start to sleep in. Okay, so examples like that. And examples like the opposite is true as well. So you want to do something but you don't, but it's also the case that you don't want to do something and you do. Like if you don't want to go to the gym, you still do, you force yourself to do it. These are examples where it seems that you're acting out of accordance with your desires. But we have to think about what we actually mean here. Because, for instance, take the gym example. You don't want to go to the gym. So why do you do it? Why do you actually force yourself to go to the gym? Well, it's like, okay, I don't want to go to the gym, but I do want to be healthy. Okay, well, why does your desire to be healthy outweigh your desire to not go to the gym and be lazy and eat junk food? Are you in control of that? Are you able to decide which desire is stronger? Bear in mind, the only reason that you actually force yourself to go to the gym is because you desire your health. If you didn't desire your health, then you just wouldn't go to the gym. You don't desire to go to the gym. But even though you don't desire to go to the gym, because there's this other conflicting desire, and you do want to be healthy, you do. And it's only because that desire exists, and because it's stronger than your desire to stay at home and be lazy, that you go to the gym. So why is that desire stronger than the other? Do you have any control over that? Well, you simply don't. If you're lying in bed in the morning, you wake up, and you think, I want to go to work on time. But then you also think, but I also quite like to sleep in. You've got two conflicting desires there. And the only possible reason that you could decide to stay in bed is because the desire to stay in bed is stronger than the desire to go to work. Now, that could be irrational. That could be a silly thing to do. It could be totally just not thought through. But the fact of the matter is that even if it's unjustifiably so, your desire to stay in bed is stronger than your desire to go to work. Because if it was stronger to go to work, then you would do that. So why is one desire stronger than another? Again, you don't get to decide this. What would it take if you're lying in bed to make you get up and go to work? That desire to go to work would have to overcome the desire to stay in bed. But again, you don't get to do this. You can't decide to desire something as we've already agreed upon. You don't get to say, I want to want this. So if it's the case that one desire is stronger than another, you will follow that desire. And in every instance, in every single instance, where it seems as though you don't want to do something, you do it anyway, it's always because of another desire. There is some desire to do that thing. If anybody has any objections to this, again, we're going to be doing a Q&A. Examples are one of the best ways to get this principle understood and comprehended. Try to think of some examples of wanting to do something and yet not doing it, and where there isn't a conflicting desire that's stronger. Because, as I say, my argument is that you will act upon your desires. Now, there are going to be conflicting desires. So there are going to be instances where you don't act in accordance with the desire. That's only because there's a stronger desire. So you're still acting in accordance with your desires, if you see what I'm saying. And that will always be the case. And that's one of the things people want to find an objection to if you want to sort of come back on that. So if you think you can think of an example, then let me know. But there's another way to think about this entire free will argument. Because there's a philosophical case that you do everything consciously because you want to, or because you desire to, let's say, or because it's the strongest desire you have. Step two is that you don't control your desires. Conclusion, you don't control anything you do. But there's another way to look at this, which is to say, which is to identify a logical dichotomy in physics, or at least the philosophy of physics. That's to say, either the universe is deterministic or it's not. These are the two options. As a matter of logic, it's a logical law that it's either the case that P or not P. It's either that this is the case or it's not the case. Determinism is the idea that the universe is following a set course. Now, this makes sense. If we understand the universe intuitively as a process of causation, everything that happens in the universe, and that includes the activity going on inside of our brains in psychology, is caused by something else. And it could be caused by something else inside of you, inside of your brain. It could be caused by something external. You can take something like a car going by. The car going by was caused by the fact that someone put their foot on the pedal, and the fact that they put their foot on the pedal was caused by the fact that they had a place to go. And the fact that they had a place to go is caused by the fact that they had a job. And this chain of causation goes all the way back to the very beginning of the universe. When a leaf falls off a tree, that happened because the connection, the leaf to the tree broke down, and that happened because of the aging process in the tree, and the tree aged because of the fact that it was planted, and it was planted literally, and it goes back and back and back and back, and back forever. And this is the deterministic case, that everything that happens is following this set course. If we are on a chain of causation, then because effects necessarily follow their cause, then what we're doing now is the result of causes, and everything that will happen in the future is a result of what's happening now, and it will follow that set course. Now, the only way out of that, the only way to say that actually it's not determined in that sense, it's following a course, but it doesn't mean that everything is on a necessary chain and can't have gone another way. It's to say that there are some instances where there's a cause, and yet more than one thing could happen. As to say, randomness. That's the only other option. Either when something happens, it's either determined in the sense that it was always going to happen by a chain of causation. The only other option is that it's indeterminate. And if it's indeterminate, then it's random. Now, the universe is determined. You don't have control, because you couldn't have acted differently. And free will, if it means anything at all, means the ability to have acted differently. Put in the same situation, there was a genuine option open to you, and you could have done this, or you could have done this, and they were both equally possible. So if you were put back in that situation, you could have gone the other way. That's what free will means in a meaningful sense, the ability to have acted differently. If the universe is determined, which intuitively would seem to be the case outside of our own experience of free will, we would wager that it makes sense to say that the universe is a process of cause and effect, and the whole thing's determined. Okay? In that situation, you clearly don't have free will, because of the fact that any conscious action you make is a result of neurons firing in your brain, which is itself a result of neural processes, which itself will be the result of some external factor or something. When you slam your foot on the brake, it's because of the external influence of seeing a car coming towards you or something like that. That chain goes back forever. But the other alternative is indeterminism, which I've said is randomness. And randomness, by definition, you don't have control over either. So think about this dichotomy. It has to be the case, and I press this as a matter of logical law. It has to be the case that either the universe is determined or it is not. And if it is determined, then we're following a set course, in which case you couldn't have acted differently. And if it's not, then yeah, you could have acted differently, but you wouldn't have been the one deciding that, because it would have to be random. So either way you look at it, you are not in control of those actions. There is the strong case of free will. You can get there more intuitively by or against free will. You can get there more intuitively by, if you take an argument like, if there are two people and both commit a crime, both commit a grave immorality, and then you learn that one of them grew up in an impoverished background and had a poor education, etc., etc., and the other one had the most sort of the perfect background, a functioning family unit, and had a great education, great job and everything, you might be inclined to see the first person as less morally responsible for their action, because you think, well, they're probably predisposed to being violent or to being evil, let's say, because of the because the hardships that they've endured. Well, that's the case for all action, is the point that I'm trying to make. Because if you discovered that your friend, who is a perfectly agreeable person in every situation, perhaps your best friend or a parent or someone that you know, would commit a crime that's just unspeakably bad, they go and murder a family, let's say, and you are just floored by this. You think, I don't understand how this person could have committed this crime. And when they go to hospital, this is an example that comes from Sam Harris, I think. When they go to hospital, when they go to prison, they start complaining of headaches. And so they're taken to hospital, and it's discovered that they've got a brain tumor pressing against the part of their brain that deals with rational thought. How does your moral evaluation change in that person if it's discovered that when they committed this crime, it was because they had a tumor pressing against the part of their brain that deals with rational thought? You probably think that makes so much more sense. And you probably be relieved to find that your friend doesn't need to be held morally culpable in the same way that they would have been before. Because the only reason they committed this crime was due to some kind of activity that happened in their brain over which they ultimately had no control. Well, that's the case with all conscious action. It's all the result of some activity happening in your brain over which you have no control. You don't decide which way your neurons fire. If I were to rewind the clock to yesterday and put you exactly where you were, and put every single atom in the universe in exactly the same place, including the atoms that make up your brain and the neurons that are firing, and they're moving in the same direction at the same speed, do you really think that you could have acted differently? It doesn't make any sense. Yet the only way that you could rewind the clock and really have acted differently is if for some reason your brain just did something different. But if all of these atoms of causation are moving in that general direction, then they're on that course and you wouldn't have been able to act differently. And if it is the case that all of this conscious action comes from something over which you have no control, then how on earth can we hold anybody morally culpable for their actions? How can we blame people when they do something wrong? How can we praise people when they do something good? It makes a mockery of the criminal justice system. When somebody is put up for a crime and they plead insanity or they plead some kind of circumstance that forced them into doing an action, we let them off. We give them a lesser charge and we hold them less morally culpable. Why? Because they didn't get to choose it. They didn't control it. We don't control any of your actions in that meaningful sense. Okay? Because if I hold a gun to someone's head and say, go and rob that bank, they're going to go and rob that bank. And they'll probably say that they were forced to do so. And yeah, I mean, it's true, but not really. I mean, they could have chosen to let me shoot them in the head. They could have chosen not to rob the bank. You would say, but no rational person would be able just to refuse to do something at gunpoint. No rational person could do that. And I completely agree with you. No rational person could. It's impossible. Because your desire to just commit this crime and get it over and done with will be stronger than your desire to be shot in the head. I can assure you of that. You don't get to choose that. You try it like put yourself in that situation and say, I'm going to try and desire to be shot in the head instead. Now, there may be circumstances if you're like, if you're an intelligence officer or something like that, and you may have been trained into that, but I mean, in a general sense, you as an individual in that situation, you don't get to decide which is better. Now, the fact of the matter is, you could have let me shoot you in the head. So should we hold you morally culpable for the crime that you commit and I hold the gun to your head? Probably not. And I don't think the criminal justice system would, and I don't think that we would hold that person morally culpable. Why not? Well, because they're only doing it because I'm forcing them. But what does it mean when I'm forcing them? I just said I'm not forcing them. They could choose to be shot in the head. Okay. So you don't mean that they're being forced. What you mean is that they have a desire to do this, which they couldn't help having that desire because the only other option was to be shot in the head. It's the case that they still desire to go and commit this crime over being shot in the head. But they couldn't help desiring that. Well, you can't help your desires no matter what. I hope you see what I'm saying here. This is a really important realization. And that's why we need to be careful about the language we use when we talk about coercion and force. Because the only reason that we consider coercion to be forced is because of the fact that by coercing someone, what you're essentially doing is forcing upon them the desire to do something. That's what it is. Because you're giving them, you're making it such that the only alternative is something which they cannot possibly desire, such as their murder. But they could choose it. It's within the laws of physics for them to choose to be murdered, but they're just not going to do it. It's not possible on a psychological level. But that's the case with all actions. Now, not to the same extent, when you have to choose between two flavors of ice cream, it's not the same severity of choosing between life and death, but it's the same principle. In the same way that you can't decide to want to be shot more than you want to commit a crime, you can't decide to want chocolate more than you want vanilla. Can't be done. I think you see now why it actually does make sense to think in terms of everything that you consciously do being due to your desires. Because, yes, there are cases where you seem to act out in accordance with your desires, but that's only such as in a situation when you go and rob the bank. You don't desire to rob the bank. You desire not to be shot. But you are still acting in accordance with your desires. Now, there is one tiny, perhaps get-out clause that people have tried to come up with. It's called compatibilism. And it is, how shall I say this, nonsense. It has a strong tradition in philosophy. It comes, one of the earliest thinkers to propound it was Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes, for instance, defined free will, where he said that a person's freedom consists in no stop in doing what he has the will, desire, or inclination to do. Standard in Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines compatibilism in the following way. It says that freedom of the sort that's pertinent to moral evaluation is nothing more than an agent's ability to do what she wishes in the absence of impediments that would otherwise stand in her way. Compatibilism is the view that, yes, you can't choose your desires, but as long as you're able to act in accordance with your desires, you're still free. Now, this is the intuitive way to think about free will, because a lot of people would define free will as just the ability to do whatever you want. Well, of course, you can do whatever you want, and the compatibilists say that that's all that matters. All that matters is that whatever it is you're doing is determined internally. It may be determined. You may have no control over that deterministic process, but as long as the cause is internal to you, as long as the cause is psychological and comes from you, the agent, it doesn't matter. You are still the author of that action, and that's what makes sense. Well, okay. So there are a number of problems with this. The first is to say that even if you say that you are the origin of the causation of the action that you committed, if you're saying that it's determined, like, who cares where it came from? Like, yeah, it may have come from inside you, but it could have come from my liver. Like, it doesn't actually make a relevant difference, the fact that it came from inside of your brain, if you didn't choose to make it come from inside of your brain. It may as well come from my big toe. But secondly, there's an important point to be made about the idea of compatibilism. And the reason it's called compatibilism is it's the view that determinism, the deterministic universe, is compatible with free will. So compatibilism assumes determinism and says that it doesn't matter because as long as the cause is internal, who cares? Well, causation is a chain. It doesn't have a start and stopping point. If something is caused internally by your psychology, that itself, that cause will have been caused by something else. And you go back far enough, and it will take you outside of the human mind. Peter Van Inwagen has a good point on this. He brings up the idea of untouchable facts, as he calls them. He says that, let's say, for argument's sake, that there is a relevant distinction to be made between facts that originate from inside of your brain and facts about the universe that are outside of you. And he says that untouchable facts are the facts that exist outside. The fact that, for instance, 10 million years ago, the atoms in the universe were arranged in X formation. That is an untouchable fact, and nobody, even the people who agree that free will exists, even the compatibilists, nobody would argue that we have any control over that. Everybody can agree that that's completely out of the picture. Now, what Van Inwagen says is, well, if I can show you that there is an untouchable fact here, and that there's something else here that happens as a necessary result of the untouchable fact, then that result is itself untouchable. This is important, because if determinism is true, then it means that your psychological state, in a really long-winded way, goes all the way back to the beginning of the universe. So the only reason that things in your brain and things in your psychology and things in your environment are the way they are now is because of this deterministic process that stretches back to 10 million years ago, and the atoms were moving in the right direction to create the Earth, longer ago than that the Earth was created, but to create you and to ensure that you would be here thinking the thing you're thinking now. So, trivially, then, if it's an untouchable fact that the universe was so-and-so 10 million years ago, and it's a necessary result of that state of affairs that you are now in the psychological state that you're in and doing the things that you're doing, then it's an untouchable fact that you're doing these things. It's a necessary result. Compatibilism completely breaks down. The only way that the compatibilist can salvage free will is by redefining free will in a sense that makes it lose all of its meaning, by just saying that free will is nothing more than the ability, as Hobbes says, to do, well, I lost it, but to be free is to find no stop in doing what he has the will, desire, or inclination to do. So you desire to do something and you have no restriction on doing that. Well, like, what are we talking about here? If I desire to go and do something and something gets in my way, then we call that a restriction. We'd equally call it, we'd see it as equally unfree if I'm walking down the street and someone pushes me into the road. Did I choose to go into the road? No, I didn't, because I was pushed, because I was coerced by an external factor. What I'm saying is if I choose to step into the street, that's due to these psychological conditions that stretch back to the beginning of the universe that I'm equally not in control of. So I'm not in control of when my brain decides to cause me to step into the street, just as I'm not in control of when someone pushes me into the street. And all the compatibilists can do is draw a completely arbitrary distinction between causes that happen outside of the brain and causes that happen inside the brain. That's what they're doing, and it doesn't make any sense. That's what Daniel Dennett does, for instance. He's probably the most prolific, famous, current compatibilist philosopher. I reached out to him to come on my podcast, and I said, would you like to discuss free will? And he got back to me and said, I watched your video. I don't like the definition of free will, so no thanks. So I was right, that's exactly what I wanted to discuss, because I think that your definition loses the meaning of free will entirely. So we've got a problem, right? If moral responsibility in the traditional sense requires the ability to have done differently. If I say that you should have done, Kant's principle of ought implies can. If I say that you ought to do this, then necessarily you have to be able to do it. I can't say that you should have done this if it was impossible for you to have done it. I can't say that it's immoral of you. I can't say that it was wrong of you to be born, or it was wrong of you to allow some dictator in some faraway country to commit some act of war. You have no control over that. And obviously, the big problem is that if moral responsibility entails the ability to genuinely choose between different options, well, that choice doesn't exist. And that's why I think that good in the traditional sense is a delusion, because good and bad and should not are grounded in the ability to choose between actions. And that simply doesn't exist. So what can we do? This is why I think it's important to create a system of ethics that can exist within this framework and can be practically indistinguishable from the traditional sense of morality, but can actually be philosophically justified and doesn't require free will. Because like I say, morality traditionally has completely required free will. It's unthinkable that you can say that you can talk about morals and should and shouldn't if everybody's just following a course that they can't control. Like, how can you possibly hold anyone morally accountable in any meaningful sense? Well, let's try. So I want to leave that hanging in the air, and I hope that many of you are at the very least now sympathetic to the idea that free will doesn't exist, even if you're not convinced. But again, that can come through Q&A and subsequent thought, but it's one of the things that I'm most convinced of in philosophy, is that free will in the traditional libertarian sense simply doesn't exist. So we'll leave that hanging in the air, and we'll move to point 2, and hopefully what's going to happen is I'm going to bring point 2 up to the same point, and they're going to conjoin, and the road is straight from there, and we'll be able to get to a fairly intuitive conclusion there. So point 2 is about the nature of desire. Because my argument is, of course, that everything that you do is based on your desires. Whatever is your chief desire, whatever is your strongest desire, which you don't get to control, that's what you're acting in accordance with. Okay, so what do we desire? Well, obviously, we desire many, many things, or at least it seems that we do. But I'm going to argue that we don't. I'm going to argue that there's only one thing that in itself is desired, and that's pleasure. And pleasure is a difficult thing to define. I like to define it along the vein of Eric Parfit, who says, essentially, pleasure is what is by definition wanted when being experienced, just as pain is by definition not wanted when being experienced. That's all pleasure means. Now, when I say that I desire to have a meal or something, it's not strictly true that I desire to have a meal. I desire the pleasure that I'm going to derive from getting that meal. Now, you might say, no, you desire the nutrient. Well, I don't desire the nutrients. I desire the pleasure that will come from being well nourished. And we have to think about, I'm not talking about pleasure in a trivial sense here. Like, pleasure, the word itself is used quite promiscuously. I mean, pleasure in a very strict sense of just being what is wanted. Now, or not what is wanted, that would be just defining, I'd say that you desire what you desire, which is just a tautology, but pleasure itself, so let's take another example, for instance, like if you desire to go for a run, it could be a multitude of reasons for this. Like, you could desire the pleasure that you get from the actual activity of running, you could desire the pleasure that you'll get from living a healthy lifestyle, whatever it is, but you don't desire the run itself. The only thing you actually desire is pleasure, and everything else that you desire is just a means to get pleasure, to achieve pleasure. Now again, you run into the problem where it's like, we seem to desire things that aren't pleasurable. Now this is the biggest objective at this point. It seems like trivial to suggest that everything you do is just because you want to, because it brings you pleasure. Like, that's just a trivial point to make. And then the trivial objection is, well, obviously we desire things that aren't pleasurable. And there are two kind of versions of this. The first is when we desire something that we know is not pleasurable. And we think it will bring us some other benefit, so we do it for virtue's sake, let's say. And we know that it's not going to be pleasurable, but we desire it anyway. The second version of this objection is that we get it wrong. We desire something thinking that it's pleasurable, but it's actually not. Now, we can take both of these in turn. So the first point, and the most difficult point, is the apparent fact that we can desire things that aren't pleasurable. For instance, going to the gym, we desire to do that even though it's not pleasurable. Or virtuous behavior is another example of this, when you pick yourself in the line of fire or something like that. Like, it seems that you know full well that that's not going to bring you pleasure, but you're going to do it anyway. Okay, well look, virtue itself is based in pleasure. People derive pleasure from living a virtuous lifestyle. And pleasure itself as well is the antithesis of pain. Pleasure can be thought of in terms of the avoidance of pain. So if you are, one of the most difficult problems for the idea that pleasure is the only thing that is desired, and this, by the way, is the view of John Stuart Mill. Mill takes it a step further, we'll get to that in a second, but he has to make his case to make his utilitarian case, because utilitarianism is based on pleasure, just as this ethical framework is. And he has to make his case. And one of the biggest problems that comes to people who espouse this utilitarian view is the example such as the soldier jumping on a grenade. You're in a room, and the grenade comes into the room, the soldier just throws himself on the grenade to save his fellow man. There's no way that can maximize his pleasure. He's not doing that because of the pleasure that it brings him. Well, yes, he is. There are a few ways around this. The first way around it is to say that he could be acting out of like reflex as a matter of his training. If you are trained to habitually put yourself in the line of fire, then you're doing something out of a matter of habit. If I habitually, fiddle my fingers or flick my nose or something, then again, because of the free will component, we can really choose to do that. It's not something that it just kind of happens. It's like reflex. But that's perhaps too easy. Okay, so let's say that this soldier actually makes the conscious decision. He looks at the grenade and thinks, I'm going to throw myself on that grenade. Well, why does he do it? Because of the virtue of doing such, like knowing that it won't be pleasurable. Well, there are two ways, again, to understand the situation of the soldier throwing himself on the grenade and still having it in terms of pleasure. The first is to take the Aristotelian view that this soldier is choosing a momentary, intense pleasure over a lifetime of a dull pleasure of living. But I think the more sensible way to look at this is that, like I say, since pleasure can be defined in terms of the absence of pain, that soldier, as a virtuous human being, and that's not a compliment, that's a matter of his psychology that he doesn't get to choose. Like, he is just a virtuous person who derives pleasure from being virtuous. If he didn't throw himself on that grenade, then he'd live the rest of his life in guilt. And that's pain. Again, pain defined strictly in terms of pleasure and pain in the utilitarian sense. It's not like a physical pain or a pang or something, but the pain of discomfort and the pain of guilt. So the question for the soldier, when he decides to throw himself on that grenade, is as simple as, I would rather die now than have to live with that pain, the guilt of knowing that that's what I should have done. Now, remember, he could be totally wrong. It could be completely irrational, and it probably is from a psychological point of view. It's probably completely irrational, certainly from an evolutionary point of view, to throw yourself on that grenade. It's absolutely irrational. But even if he's irrational about it, it's still a matter of fact that in that moment, he thinks that if he doesn't do this, he'll regret it. He derives the pleasure from the virtue, and he derives the pleasure backhandedly from the avoidance of pain if he decided not to jump on that grenade, that he would live the rest of his life in guilt. Now, it's a complicated issue, and I can see why people would have problems with the idea that everything you do is ultimately based in pleasure. But again, it's got a long tradition within philosophy, and a lot of people have agreed with this. And it's because we're defining pleasure and pain fairly strictly, and we are finding ways, we're finding examples that seem to contradict the idea that we do things for pleasure's sake, and we're going through them one by one and just finding out how they can actually be and are actually based in pleasure. And that's probably the best way to do it. So again, the best way to try and object to this and discuss this is to just try and come up with counterexamples, and eventually it just kind of clicks and you see how everything ultimately does come down to pleasure. Another interesting hypothetical might be, for instance, if I offered a parent two choices. First choice, your children are going to be super successful in life, but you're going to think that they're not. You're living in another country, you don't get to contact them, and you're going to live your life thinking that they're having an awful life. Or option B, they have a terrible life, but you believe that they're having a great life, and you can be comforted by the fact that your children are having a great life. Now, what does the parent do in that situation? Okay, this is difficult to unpack, because I think a lot of parents, most parents, I would say I hope, but I suppose it's up to you. A lot of parents, I think, and many that I've asked would say, what I would do is I would choose for my children to have a good life, and for me to live the rest of my life in pain, thinking that they were having a terrible life, because I'd rather them actually have a good life. This seems to completely contradict the idea that we're only doing things for pleasure's sake. But again, it's not strictly true. Because with the position of omniscience that you grant the parent before this situation begins, they know what's actually going to happen. The reason that they want their children to have a good life is because they derive pleasure from the knowledge that their children are going to have a good life. And even when you offer them the opportunity to take that pleasure away from them, and say, you're not going to actually experience that pleasure, the pleasure in making the right decision, in being a virtuous person in that instance when they have to make that decision, outweighs the pleasure that they think they'll receive from living a life just thinking that their children are doing well. Now again, they're probably wrong about this. Like, rationally speaking, the best thing you can probably do is let your children have a terrible life and live nice and happy. Like, rationally speaking, that's what you probably should do. But the fact of the matter is that even if they're wrong, even if it's actually not going to maximize their pleasure to make the decision they made, they're making it because they think that it will. They're making it because in that moment,
I don't think
their
that's
pleasure
rational,
will maximize
actually,
in that
because
second, in that
they're
instance,
equal in
they're
value
making
to
a
yourself.
virtuous choice.
So it's not the actual rational thing.
So
it can be a rational from a
that's
selfish
kind of
thing to do,
part two.
but not a rational thing like
There's the second version of the objection, actually, that we desire things that we mistakenly think are pleasurable. This is fairly trivial in itself. Like, yeah, okay, so we desire things that we think are pleasurable, but they turn out not to be pleasurable. This is actually a good way to demonstrate the fact that we don't desire things in themselves, but we desire pleasure. Let's say that you desire a meal, but you don't know that that meal is actually poisoned. Right? Somebody's out to poison you. Okay, so you have that meal, and you'll curl up in pain. You'll realize that you didn't desire that meal. You desired the pleasure that you thought you were going to get from having a nice meal. Right? And demonstrated by the fact that you had the meal, but now you're poisoned. Like, no desire of yours has actually been fulfilled. You didn't just desire the meal itself, you desire the pleasure that would derive from it, and so when you don't get that pleasure, like, no desire has actually been fulfilled. So when you desire something that you think is pleasurable but isn't pleasurable, you actually don't desire that thing. You desire the pleasure that will derive from it. So you still are desiring pleasure. Even if you desire something that's not pleasurable as a mistake, you're still desiring pleasure, ultimately. That's why we need to be careful to distinguish means from ends. Now, where it gets interesting is when we start to put these things together. It seems like a really, really strange thing to say. I know that you make this whole free will argument, which seems like way in the past now, and now I'm making this argument about some psychological tendency of human beings. Like, what on earth does any of this got to do with morality? You can see kind of why the free will thing would have a bad implication for morality. What's this pleasure thing got to do with it? The question is, can we objectify this notion of desire and pleasure? This is what John Stuart Mill tried to do, as I said, we'd come back to. Essentially, Mill makes the point in chapter 3 of utilitarianism that the only, he makes like a kind of epistemological point, like how can we trust facts about the natural world? How do I know that this microphone stand is visible? How do I know that that is actually visible? He says the only possible evidence we have that that microphone stand is visible is that we see it. That's it. That's the only evidence we have. And he likewise concludes, the only evidence we have that something is desirable, that is, should be desired, is that we do desire it. In the same way that the only evidence that we have that something is actually audible is that we hear it. The only evidence that something is desirable is that we desire it. Now, this is quite an interesting point. I mean, like, why do we justify the fact that we're going to say that this microphone stand exists because we can see it and it's visible because we can see it, but we're not willing to cross the Isle divide in the same sense when it comes to desirability and being desired? And again, you've got the point of induction, which I brought up earlier. We are willing to reason that because this is the case, I'm going to reason that this will be the case, because it is the case that gravity has consistently worked for all of human history. I'm going to trust that it will work in 5 minutes' time. It's totally illogical. There's no logical validity to that. You can't prove that it will work in the future, but we have no problem reasoning that. So why don't we do the same thing with pleasure and desirability? Why don't we just say that we all desire pleasure by definition? So why don't we just say that it's desirable, that it should be desired? Like, it's the same thing. Like, sure, we all subjectively just agree that pleasure is desired. There's no objectivity to it. We just subjectively feel, as a matter of opinion, that pleasure is good. Like, we all think pleasure is good. Well, we all think that our senses work. We all think that the sun's going to rise tomorrow. Nobody knows it. But because we all agree, like, everybody agrees that induction is accurate. Everybody just subjectively agrees that they can trust their senses. They just feel that way, they're convinced of it. And so we say that it is. Induction is accurate. Gravity will work in 5 minutes, and the sun will rise tomorrow. But why don't we just do the same thing with pleasure and desirability? We all agree that pleasure is good in the sense that we defined it. So why don't we just say that it is? Now, look, you can do this if you want, and I don't think it's unreasonable to do so. And this is one of the points where, this is one of the sticking points for Stephen with me. He was like, Alex, why are you allowing yourself to base empiricism and your senses and science and all of this on just the subjective notion that your senses are giving you correct information? You're just not willing to do the same thing for morality. And, it's a good point. It is an inconsistency. And so it's an argument I'm sympathetic to just objectify the ethics in that sense, but that would be cheap of me to have you all here and to just say, well, we may as well objectify the ethics. No, I want to offer another alternative, which is a way to objectify ethics without crossing the ism divide, without crossing from is to will be, without crossing from today to tomorrow, without crossing from is to ought. We're going to stay in the realm of is, and we're going to get something that's practically indistinguishable from ethics. So how does this work?
See, I believe that is already crossed with experience. That I can testify to that. But when it comes down to it, I'm willing to hear more. It's been a while since I've heard this.
Let's go through the steps.
Again, he's in the modus now, so it's
okay,
probably not that
okay,
strong.
you do action X, whatever it may be. And we want to determine, is that action right or wrong? That's ethics. Right and wrong behavior, right and wrong action. You do X, are you right or wrong? So, why have you done X? Well, we know from the arguments that we've just put forward that you're doing X because you think it will maximize your pleasure. Like, as a matter of fact, like, I know that the reason you are doing this is because you think it will maximize your pleasure. Like, necessarily. Because the free will argument states you only do what you are determined by your desires. The pleasure argument says that you ultimately can only desire pleasure in itself. So I know that anytime you do anything, you think, even if you don't realize it, that that's going to maximize your pleasure. Pleasure is a state of consciousness. It's measurable. You are either right or wrong as a matter of objective fact as to whether that will maximize your pleasure or not. And this is the point that Sam Harris makes, that it's objective. We can know whether or not something maximizes pleasure or whether it's actually going to bring you more pain. He just takes that extra step to say that, and we should desire pleasure. That's the jump that people have trouble with. It's like, okay, nobody has a problem with saying that there are facts to be known about state of the brain. There are facts to be known about pleasure and pain. What we're saying is, why should we chase pleasure? Why should we avoid pain? That's the jump that I'm trying to avoid here. So if it's the case that you are doing something, that you doing something necessarily indicates that you believe something about the natural world, which it does, because you doing an action necessitates that you believe that that action will maximize your pleasure, then that action indicates a belief that you hold that is objectively either correct or incorrect. And more than this, you believe that in such a way that if you're wrong, if you do an action, necessarily that means that you think it will maximize your pleasure. If you're wrong about that, then it won't maximize your pleasure. The only way that you can correct your belief is in such a way that would make you act differently. Because if you corrected your belief about the natural world and you realize actually this isn't going to maximize my pleasure, this is going to maximize my pleasure, then necessarily because you're determined by your desires and you desire pleasure, you will do this. You must do option 2. So every time you commit an action, you are necessarily indicating a belief that you hold that is either right or wrong in such a way that can only be rectified by acting differently. This is practically indistinguishable from ethics. But what we have here is not a situation where I'm saying certain actions are right or wrong. So you can do something. I can't say that that thing itself was wrong. What I can say is you doing this indicates a belief that you hold that is wrong, that can only be rectified to be objectively true in such a way that would require you to change your action. Because if I did rectify that, and I showed you what was true, that this is going to maximize your pleasure, then you would have to do that. So this is indistinguishable from ethics. It's a long-winded way of doing it. It's kind of like an agent-based ethical theory. I'm not talking about the actions, we're talking about the person. Agent-based ethical theories have, again, a long philosophical tradition, but not quite in this sense. Because you'll notice that we are staying in the is category. What I'm saying is that it is the case that you doing this action means that you think it will maximize your pleasure. And it is the case that you are wrong about that. And it is the case that if I corrected you and you believed, and you believed me, and you became correct yourself, you would act differently. So you're wrong in such a way that can only be rectified by you acting differently. Like, that is indistinguishable to me from saying what you're doing is wrong, change it. But you don't have to involve any kind of ought. You don't have to involve any kind of should. It stays in the realm of objectivity and scientific empiricism. Take an example. Rape is wrong. Okay, so if somebody rapes, they do it because they think it will maximize their pleasure, necessarily. That's a belief that they hold. And again, it's necessarily indicated by their action. And that's why I have to press the free will point. That's why I have to press the pleasure point, because we can now know that if somebody does this crime, we know as a matter of fact that because they are determined by their desires and because they can only desire pleasure, they must think that that's going to maximize their pleasure. Now, I think that that person who commits the rape is wrong, objectively wrong, in the sense that as a social species, your pleasure will actually be maximized if you don't rape. Like, I believe that to be the case. And if and I think that that's an objective fact. Now, I could be right or wrong about that, like in practice, but in principle, there is a right answer to that question. Like, we can scientifically, objectively determine, in principle, if not in practice, whether or not a certain action is actually going to maximize your pleasure. So if you commit a rape and I say, I think you're wrong because I know that that means that you think it's going to maximize your pleasure, but actually that won't maximize your pleasure. What will maximize your pleasure, since we're a social species, is not raping. Then, in order for them to correct that belief, it would necessitate them changing their action. Again, there's no should involved in it. So, again, it's important to note that we could be wrong about this. Like, I'm not making a point to say that because of the arguments I've construed, we can know whenever you commit an action if you are right or wrong, because we might not actually be able to work out what's actually going to maximize pleasure. Like, it's difficult to measure the point of the brain. But the fact of the matter is that there is a correct answer, even if we can't yet get to it because we're sort of technologically limited or whatever. That answer does exist, and it is a matter of objectivity. So rightness lies not in the act. It's not that the action you're doing is right or wrong. It's that the action indicates the belief you hold that's right or wrong in such a way that if you're wrong, you can only become right in a way that will make you act differently. So what about language? How can I say, like, without crossing the is or divide, I still want to be able to use ethical language like should. It's useful, right? So how can we do this? How can we make it truly indistinguishable? Well, what do we mean by should? I don't know what you mean by should, but when I say that you should do something, what I tend to mean is something along the lines of, if you could see things the way that I saw them, you would. When I say, you should go and help that person across the street, it's like, man, if you could see things the way I'm seeing them right now, you go and help that person across the street. Now, if I say to this rapist, you shouldn't do that, what I mean is, look, if you could see things the way I saw them, you wouldn't do that. That's a fact. Because if that person saw, as I see, that this action will not maximize their pleasure, then by definition, they wouldn't do it. So I say you should do this. I mean, if you saw it how I saw it, you would do this. That's a fact. And we haven't crossed any is or divide in the traditional sense. We are still within the realm of is. When I say if you press that button, the car should start, what I mean is, according to my understanding of the natural facts of the universe, and the laws of physics, and the state of affairs that exist right now, when you press that button, the car will start. I say the word should to indicate that I could be mistaken. When I say that you should do this action, when I say you should give to charity, I mean that according to my understanding of the natural facts of the world and how things are in the state of affairs, including the psychological state of your brain, you would, according to, like, if you saw it the way that I saw it, you would. I say you should do this. In the same way that when I say, if you press the button, the car should start, I mean, I think that it will start. When I say you should do this, I mean, I think that you would do this. If you saw it the way that I saw it, which you would, and that's a matter of fact. There are some objections, like what if this leads us to uncomfortable conclusions? What if it is just the fact that genuinely we do derive, like there is a person who would genuinely derive more pleasure from committing an evil act than not committing an evil act? What does that, we just find that that is actually the case? Well, unfortunately, like that would be an unfortunate conclusion. The fact is, if it is true that this unfortunate conclusion would actually maximize their pleasure, then because of the free will argument, they have no choice but to do it anyway. So there's nothing that we could rectify in any sense. Like, we wouldn't be able to do anything about it. So it's not worth worrying about in the sense that if the problem ever arose, it arises in such a way that we couldn't do anything about it. Now, some people will just accuse me of just rehashing the case for hedonism, like the utilitarian case, that pleasure is the basis of morality. Like, wow, big shocker, right? But no, because again, I'm not crossing this is or divine. I'm not saying that because we desire pleasure, it's therefore desirable. I'm saying we desire pleasure, and I know that all of your action indicates a belief that you hold about what will maximize pleasure, and you can be right or wrong about that. There's no should involved there. The only other point you can make against this is another kind of meta-ethical case, which is to say, let's say that you're someone who does believe that there is such a thing as objective good and bad, like a divine right or something, a divine code. What happens if our desires are inaccurate? What if we desire what is bad? What if pleasure is bad, according to whatever objective definition of good and bad you come up with? Well, once again, the fact of the matter is, even if we desire things that are bad, the fact that we desire them means that we have to do them as a matter of the free will argument. So I'm afraid that there's just no way around the fact that if we all desire pleasure, which we do, then that has to be the basis and motivation for our action. And we can talk about right or wrong in terms of pleasure, in terms of facts about pleasure. But if we're wrong about that in some kind of meta-ethical sense, like, there's nothing we can do about that. It's impossible because we have to be determined by our desires. But also, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter because we all subjectively agree that pleasure is good. So if we act in accordance with that, no one's going to be bothered. So, finally, it's worth pointing out that this actually applies to much moral things, like helping a person across the street with a challenge. But any action, if you take a sip of water, it's because you think that in that instance it's going to maximize your pleasure. You're either right or wrong about that. Like, you can talk about this right or wrong in terms of any action you do. When you open a car door, when you step your right foot first and say your left foot first, whatever it is, because this conscious action driven by your desires, and your desires are always linked to pleasure, you can say of any action that it indicates rightness or wrongness. And this might seem like it's not ethical, but it's not ethics. This talk is the closest we can get to ethics. Because yeah, it applies to all instances of action, but that includes the moral ones. And who cares, man? Like, if you open a door, like, who cares if it maximizes your pleasure? Like, who cares if that indicates a belief you're right or wrong about it? No one cares. Like, you can work it out if you want to, but it's not a big deal. But if you commit a moral act, the political leader needs to make a decision. You need to make a moral decision. If you need to choose how to bring up your children, something of that sort, then we do care. And that's when we make the calculations, and that's when we try to work out what will actually maximize our pleasure, and we can objectively say that that makes you right or wrong. You can be right or wrong about anything, but the instance that we're going to care is when that applies to what we traditionally thought of as moral goods. So look, you've got this traditional conception of good and bad, which is a delusion, because it requires the ability to do otherwise, which isn't there. Simply not there. That tradition of good and should is a complete delusion. But we can use the same language and mean something that is practically indistinguishable, and yet have it grounded in an objective basis that not only doesn't require free will, but requires that free will does not exist. So when people have an existential angst, when you bring up the free will thing, then they suddenly realize.
His argument is that you value only pleasure and maximizing your pleasure, and it's not that you should do something that you maximize your pleasure, but that, sorry, it's not that you ought to do something to maximize your pleasure, but that you should. It just makes sense from a practicality standpoint. So if you're able to do that, then I say you can also say from a logical standpoint that given my $5 equal to your $5, you should, whatever, indistinguishable, basically, value other people's pleasure and pain, avoidance. Not sure if that makes sense, but I think it does. let's get back to playing the video.
Realize, like, my God, morality has collapsed. Well, no, it hasn't. You can keep doing things exactly the way you were doing before. Use the same language you were using before. Condemn the same things you were condemning before. Say that the same things you thought were good and bad are still good and bad. But you just justify it differently. And so when I said at the beginning of this talk, one of the big problems of ethics is that people will have the same conclusions, but that's not the interesting part. The interesting part and where the disagreement lies in the justifications. Well, here's your justification. That solves that problem. It doesn't matter why someone else believes it. If you both agree that murder is wrong, they believe it because God tells them, and you believe it because of this ethical framework. Like, it doesn't matter practically. It's fine. But you can kind of rest assured knowing that you can justify that opinion, you can justify that decision as an objective fact without having to cross the or is divide and without having to have some delusory concept of free will. So I think, given that we're beginning to run out of time, I'd like to open it up. Should there be any questions?
Okay, as usual, we're going to hand the mic round. So Dean has got a mic, and yeah, Toby, I think, is first. So we can come to Toby. Dean, and just hold the microphone in front of your mouth when you are in possession of it.
What, like this? Okay, good. I just want to go back to your point you made about the line that compatibilists draw between things that are determined outside of an individual and things that are determined internally. I would dispute that the line drawn there is arbitrary, because even though I agree with you that a libertarian aspect of free will doesn't exist, I think that when things are determined psychologically, it does create the illusion of free will. And in regards to ethics, I think that illusion existing is probably more useful, because you, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to phrase this very well, so if you, I hope you pick up what I'm trying to say. But you mentioned when you were talking about the use of language such as should, it was a sort of shorthand for if you saw things my way, you should do this differently. I would argue it's probably easier to influence people's views to see things similar to how you do if they do have the illusion of free will. Because going back to the example of forcing someone to rob a bank at gunpoint, even though obviously they would have a desire to rob a bank to avoid being shot, it perhaps wouldn't be as strong as their desire to find a way out of the situation where they can incapacitate the gun and not have to do either getting shot or... sorry.
So I think you make a point about whether it's more useful to allow people to have this illusion of free will, because, or to have this illusion of free will yourself, because of the fact that that can be easier to make people make moral decisions.
I think so. I do think that people would be more willing to make particular choices if they believe or had some notion of them being in control.
Right. Okay. So
would you agree that would be useful?
What I understand what you're saying is that the line that's drawn isn't arbitrary, because of the fact that when things aren't internally determined, although they are determined, and philosophically we can recognize we don't have control, those are the actions that we feel like we have control of, and that's an illusion. And if people have that illusion, then it becomes easier to think of themselves as moral agents. Well, there are 2 points to make there. The first is that, like, that may be true. It may also be true, for instance, that belief in God benefits society or something. No, I don't believe this, but if that were true, that wouldn't change the fact that I'm not convinced that God exists. It's 2 separate questions. So my job here, and what I'm trying to do, is to express to you what I believe to be true. Now, you might come back and say, well, that's not a useful thing to believe, and you might be right. But that doesn't affect the truth value of what I'm saying. So in the same way that if I give a talk trying to convince people that philosophically speaking, I'm convinced that there's no good reason to believe that there's a God, and someone turns around and says, well, isn't it more useful to have this illusion of God, not just for other people, but for yourself as well? Like, maybe. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about what I think is true. It's up to you to decide what you think is most useful. What I am saying is that if you do think it's more useful to have the illusion of free will, you can't have that illusion if you're convinced that free will doesn't exist. If you're convinced that, again, ironically, because of the fact that free will doesn't exist, if someone convinces you that free will doesn't exist, you can't just choose to keep the illusion. Like, you will just be convinced that free will does not exist. The point of this is to say that if you think it's more useful to believe in free will, part of the reason for that is probably because if there is no free will, you think there's no real way to talk about ethics. I'm saying that I'm trying to give a way to get rid of them, to make it such that it's not, in fact, it doesn't need to be more useful to have the illusion of free will, because I can construct a case where free will doesn't exist, and yet we can talk about ethical responsibility. And so even if it is the case, or even if it's been previously the case that it's more useful to have the illusion of free will for moral agency, I'm trying to make the case that actually that's not true, because you can have an ethical case that doesn't require free will, but equally, I think the main response to that is to say that you may be completely right, it may be more useful to have that illusion, but that doesn't change whether it's true or not. And also, the distinction, if the distinction is not arbitrary between internal and external causation, it's only non-arbitrary in the sense of it being an experienced illusion. It's still arbitrary in the sense of moral responsibility. But if an internal causation does give you an illusion where an external causation doesn't, then yeah, there's a meaningful difference there. But it's not meaningful in an ethical sense. Because if there were 2 external causes, one of which caused someone to believe that they were choosing to commit a crime, and one of which caused someone to just commit the crime, we'd say in both cases like they're not morally responsible, because it was determined by something external. Just take one of those and put it internal, ethically the situation doesn't change. The only thing that changes is whether or not a person believes they're doing it of their own accord or not, but they're still not, and so they still can't be philosophically held responsible. So it only makes a relevant difference in terms of experience and not in terms of actual moral responsibility, I think.
Okay, right, got a few hands going up. Let's go to Estelle. Dawn, you had your hand up as well. Estelle first.
Thank you. I just felt originally that reason played the back seat all the time, this desire, desire, desire. And if one has a little bit more reason, maybe that will give the idea that you're doing some thinking before you just jump to do something, which happens, of course. And then the other thing was, Hume, talking about Hume, people have challenged and said that ought implies can.
Yes, so 2 points to make there. Firstly, do you desire to be reasonable?
No. I just do what I have to do at the time.
Well, you do what you have to do. You do what you have to do.
Yes.
And you do that because you desire to do it.
No, not necessarily. I'm probably forcing myself to do it.
Okay, so what do you mean by forcing yourself?
Sorry?
Well, what do you mean by forcing yourself?
Well, there's some things you've just got to get done. You can't live your life just trying to be happy and pleasure and all that sort of thing. You hope it's going to come along somewhere, but duty also is there as well. And if I have a duty to do, then I will do that.
Okay, why?
Because it will make me feel I've done what I wanted to do, but not necessarily for pleasure.
That's right.
It's not necessary for pleasure, though.
So pleasure is simply defined as in an intuitive sense, if you're doing something because you want to do it, like it's bringing you pleasure, you derive pleasure from the knowledge that you're doing your duty. You derive pleasure from the fact that you're doing what's virtuous.
Well, maybe pleasure is the word that's making these things all difficult.
Yes.
I could get comfort from doing something I should have done a while back, but I go and do it, and I'm not happy afterwards. I might still be quite cross with myself for leaving it so long. But comfort, then, is a better word than pleasure.
Yeah, perhaps. And you can use whatever terminology you see there. I would simply say that pleasure, that you still derive pleasure from the comfort. Comfort is not the end in itself. Comfort is not, the only reason that we strive for comfort is because comfort is enjoyable, because comfort brings us that pleasure of enjoyment. But you may be right, like it may be, again, more useful to use different terminology. But as long as we both understand what we mean by pleasure, which I think we more or less do at least now, like, you may be right, the terminology may be not particularly useful, but again, the point still remains the same. And then if the term was good enough for Mill, then it's good enough for me.
And of course, this proved very interesting in court cases and legal stuff. So they recognized they had to have some sort of punishment for people that did things. And then all this became not as important, but it's a very good method of discussion, I must say.
And just on the point of Hume, people have disputed Hume's whole distinction, but the controversy is not. So you seem to suggest that ought implies can, which is a principle that comes from Immanuel Kant.
Well, I read somebody said that.
Yeah. So these are actually two separate issues. So ought implies can is not a response to the is ought distinction. It would be more something like ought implies is. That would be a response. It would be a nonsensical response. But if you had some conception that ought implies is, then yeah, that would contradict the idea that there's going to be no cross between this and ought.
But you can't say people ought to fly.
If they can't, right?
Yes.
So ought implies can is true.
Yes.
That's not incompatible with the is ought problem. So the whole point is that because ought implies can, if there is no free will in the libertarian sense, then because you have to do whatever option you chose, that's what we mean by there being no free will, you have to do option A. You couldn't have done option B. We can't say you ought to have done option B because ought implies can, and if you couldn't do B, then we can't say that you ought to do it. So it's perfectly compatible, and ought implies can exists in a different conversation to the ought distinction.
So you could
Estelle, I'm just wondering if we can let other people have a chance. Okay.
Oh, you're a bit afterwards.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, John, did you have your hand up? No. Okay. Let's come to Peter, or the person sitting next to Peter. Sorry.
I just wanted to know if you believe that there is no such thing as a selfless act, because in the instance about a soldier throwing himself, is there no such thing as bravery either?
So
because he doesn't have time to. The fact that you said that he doesn't have time to think could be to do with his training, but it could also be that he doesn't have time to have a negative thought, so he's driven to a positive action, possibly because he just wants to do the right thing.
Yeah. So. I don't think there's such a thing as a selfless act in strict terms. That is to say, I don't think that it's possible to do something consciously that doesn't benefit you in some way. And we can explore that. But so you say like the soldier could be doing it out of bravery. Well, again, why be brave? There is a certain enjoyment that is derived from the knowledge that you're acting virtuously in accordance with bravery.
So there is no such thing as a selfless act?
I don't think so. And I can demonstrate it perhaps with the following thought experiment. This might not work. It hasn't worked for everybody, but it's worth reflecting on. I wish I could tell you where it came from. For me, where it came from was some conversation in a pub with a physics and philosophy student before I was studying at university. We were just talking, and out of nowhere comes the question, would you rather kill an innocent person and then immediately forget about it? Or not kill an innocent person, but live the rest of your life thinking that you had? Just think about that for a second. What do you think you would rather do? Now, the immediate response is, obviously, I'd rather let the person live, I'll take the hit. Like, no, nobody in their right mind is really taking that option. Now, again, you might do, I would argue that it would be irrational to do so, and I think that if you are honest with yourself, and again, not everyone's going to agree with this, if you're honest with yourself, I think, or at least you can at least sympathize with people who would say that actually, like, I have to live the rest of my life not thinking I'm guilty as a person, I couldn't live with that guilt. And if you do agree with that, I think that demonstrates the fact that there really is no such thing as a selfless act, because that would be an example of a selfless act. The selfless act would be choosing to allow that innocent person to live, live the rest of your life thinking that you've murdered them, assuming that you're a moral person who would get some guilt from thinking that you killed them. So if you think, so that would be an example of a selfless act. But I would even wager that even if you chose to do that, even if you really said no, you stopped with your guns and said, I'm doing that, I'd still say that that's because when you're making this decision, you have the knowledge of the whole situation, and you're going to take pleasure from the fact that you're acting virtuously by making that decision, if you see what I'm saying.
What about the rights of, what about you don't have the right to take a person's rights?
Yeah, so Mill does this really well in utilitarianism, that his final chapter, because justice and the issue of rights is such an important, seemingly like difficult or contradictory notion to the idea of utilitarianism and other pleasure-based moral theories, that he devotes an entire chapter to justice and rights, and he essentially concludes, and I'm sympathetic to this argument, that rights themselves are based in pleasure. Now, it may be the case that this is the common arguments against utilitarianism, and they can apply to this ethical framework as well, because of pleasure, are things like, there might be an instance where it is genuinely more pleasurable for someone to commit a bad act. Like there's the example of the organ transplant, which some of you will be familiar with, where there are 5 people who all need an organ transplant desperately, and they're all on the brink of death. And in walks someone to the hospital to get checked up for a cold. Just as it happens, he has a perfect match for all the organs. Like, should we kill that man, give the organ transplant, let 5 people live? It increases the overall pleasure. Like, and people would say no, and the only way that you can say that you can't kill that person with the organs is because that person has a right to life. That seems to contradict the pleasure. Well, not entirely, because we have to see it in the context of a situation whereby if people knew that when they walked into a hospital, there was a possibility that they might get pulled down and cut open for their guts, they're not living a very pleasurable life. So your pleasure is actually maximized by allowing a system of rights, which may in individual instances not maximize your pleasure, but overall will maximize your pleasure. So you're still doing what you think will maximize your pleasure. That is setting up a system of rights that will ensure that you can live comfortably and know that your rights will be protected, even if there are certain instances where it means you have to abstain from restricting someone else's rights in a way that would bring you more pleasure, because overall, the system of rights brings more pleasure to everybody.
Let's try and get some more questions in if we can. I think I'm going to extend this a little while, maybe another 10 minutes, if you're, because a number of people want to still get. So yeah, let's go to Dan next. Then we'll go to Aaron, then Simon.
If you could have a procedure done where the set of things that bring you pleasure were changed in some way, do you think that you would still be the same person? Afterwards, if all of your memories were the same?
Interesting. If you see me like, I would derive pleasure from different tastes in music or different types of food or something like that.
It could be different tastes in music, perhaps things that lead you to make different moral decisions.
Well, that's interesting. I think people are more or less defined by their actions. I think people are defined by what they do, and I think that who a person is practically synonymous with their history of behaviour. So I think it would change the person that you are. Personal identity is a big, it's a confusing topic, and whatever it is that makes you you. I think you can choose whatever criteria you want to decide what makes a person that person. But you can just frame the question as like, if a friend of yours was hit in the head by a rock and it caused some weird psychological activity, and they woke up the next day and all their desires had like changed. Well, their desire hasn't changed because they still desire pleasure, but they think they'll get pleasure from other things. Well, they will, just like their taste in food changes and their way of behaving changes. Are they still the same person? Like maybe not. I probably still consider them the same person. I think I would consider them the same person, because I think that there's more that goes into a person, more makes a person than what brings them pleasure. But an interesting thing to note is that nothing could change what it is that they actually desire. The only thing that could change is the means that they use to bring about the pleasure. The fact that they desire pleasure itself would have changed. I'll have to think about that one. I think I'd come down on the side of saying that, yeah, they're the same person. But like, it depends how differently they're acting. Like if my brother had a change of heart or a stroke or something, and just started acting completely differently, I might use terminology like he's just not the same person anymore. And you can take that to mean what you will. He's still the same person physically, but it makes sense to see them as different identity.
Yeah, let's move on if we can. Let's go to Aaron next. Thank you.
I think it's quite nice to know that my desire and pleasure taken from not eating vegetables is a good thing after all. The question is, if we're in a lifeboat holds 100 people, we've got 110 people in there, and we're going along, and there's 50 people in water. The virtuous thing would be to rescue them all, but we'd sink the boat. What do we do?
So the virtuous thing in that instance wouldn't then be to save the 50. Like, imagine you're in a boat on your own, and there are 150 people, or let's say 149 people in water, and the boat has a maximum capacity of 100 people. Like, what's the virtuous thing to do? It's to pick up 99 people. The virtuous thing to do isn't to pick up everyone, because that would sink the boat and everyone would die. The virtuous thing to do is to pick up 99 people and ensure that you maximise the saving lives, that you maximise the pleasure there. So in an instance where you're going past, and there are 150 people, and there are people in the water, like, morally speaking, that is kind of arbitrary. Which people are in the boat, which people are outside of the boat? Like, they all, presumably, if we're presuming they were just innocent, there's none of them like murderers or rapists or anything like that, then yeah, it becomes arbitrary, in which case the virtuous thing to do is probably to just sail by, because of the fact that the thing that nudges it slightly in favour of the people who are already in the boat is, again, this culture of rights, the fact that we were here first, so we get to stay here. But that's only a very slight thing, but because it's completely arbitrary which people are serving for life there, that's enough to nudge it in that direction. But it's perfectly virtuous just sail by, because it's just about the maximisation of the pleasure.
Let's just come to Simon, and then I think I'm just going to take two more. Yes, Johan, and then Peter, and then I think we'll have to draw things to a close.
Can I ask you a couple of questions following on from discussion with Lady Estelle, the lady in the blue sweater? I'm sorry?
Can't promise I'll answer.
Well, they're about your theory.
Yeah.
Can you allow that any action cannot be pleasurable, given that how you defined pleasure? People put up various examples, and you said, no, there is a pleasure really there. Even sadism is regarded as pleasure, and even going beyond a grenade is regarded as pleasure, because you found some ingenious way to say that that's maximising the amount of pleasure. Are there any instances you would allow where pleasure, an action would not be maximising your pleasure?
Not if you consciously do it. That's the point of the free will argument, is that whatever you do necessarily indicates that that you think it will maximise your pleasure. Now, the important point to note is that you could be wrong about it. So when the soldier jumps on the grenade, like, yeah, okay, so I made an argument that that's based on pleasure. I'm not saying that the soldier will derive more pleasure from jumping on the grenade. I'm saying that the soldier thinks that he'll derive more pleasure, even just subconsciously so. So there are behaviours that you can make that will, so for instance, if you choose to take a shortcut when you're riding, you do so because you think it's going to maximise your pleasure in terms of getting to the place on time or whatever. It turns out you've taken a wrong turn, you've just got it wrong, and it's actually minimise your pleasure. You've just done something that hasn't maximised your pleasure. Like, there's your example. But you can't do something thinking that it will minimise your pleasure unless you think it will minimise your pleasure at the expense of another virtue, like virtue itself or bravery or whatever it may be, which itself is just kind of the backhanded version of pleasure. So,
Well, that's my difficulty, that everything that you desire to do appears to be pleasure, or you're virtually minimising the use of language. So you can't say, well, that was selfless, that was selfless. No, it was just selfish because it was maximising his pleasure. Many other instances where basically you're taking away the language which people find extremely helpful to use and saying, well, everything you do is selfish.
yeah, sorry.
Well, in that case, haven't your theory, all it's really achieved, unless you're going to, in part two, you're going to show us what it's achieved. All you've done is reduce the language to, well, you've impoverished the language.
So what we've done is there is a definition that's taken place. I think with words like should, for instance. I'm trying to get people to understand the word should in a different light. But the aim of the talk, the aim of the theory isn't to do with language. I mean, language is an incredibly important part of philosophy, but you can adapt language however you like. And I think that words like should and words like selfless can be understood in this framework if we just give them a caveat and understand that when I say that that's a selfless act, like what I mean by that is an act that appears selfless, and in a traditional libertarian sense would appear to be selfish. You can still keep that language. But the point of the talk, you said that all that's achieved is an impoverishment of the language. Well, what I'm trying to achieve here is a meta-ethical objective basis for justifying conceptions of morality in a world with no free will. The point is that there are many people who are increasingly becoming convinced that free will doesn't exist. Sorry about that again, by the way. And it leaves you with a big problem for morality. And all I'm doing here is saying, actually, if you do believe that there's no free will, you can construct an ethical framework that works objectively despite that fact. And if you disagree, if you think that free will does exist, if you think that there are things that you desire that are pleasurable, if you think you can do things that you don't actually desire to do, and all this kind of stuff, then you can think that, and you can keep using that language, and you can keep talking in those terms. What I'm going to say is that philosophically, it just has no grounding for me. But continue to do it if you wish.
Right, we're going to try and get two more in, and we'll try and keep it as brief as possible. Johan, and then Peter, and then we will have a refreshment break, you'll be pleased to know. Johan.
So I'm just wondering what are the implications on the criminal justice system. So if a criminal pleads insanity and it's accepted, it will be one punishment, and if they're determined to have done it in full conscience, with full conscience, then they will have a more severe punishment. I'm just wondering. Yeah.
So criminal justice system might not need to change practically, because I don't know what in practice will actually minimise suffering and pain, and obviously that's kind of the aim now, as I've expanded. I think that is the aim, that is the goal, is to do with pleasure and pain. So I don't know if practically it needs to change, but something needs to change its outlook, which is criminal justice. I don't think, if we say there's no free will, then it simply can't be seen in a retributive sense. We can't see someone being thrown in jail as, yeah, we've done that because they deserve it. You know, I remember, I think it was when Larry Nassar was sentenced, and there was this judge, and when she was delivering the sentence, she did it I think she took his appeal or something and physically threw it like away, and it went viral on Facebook, and everyone was like, yes, yes. And I was just appalled. But this is not what criminal justice should be for. We're not here to say, like, you deserve to rot in prison, throw away your appeal, go and rot away. It's a practical installment. Criminal justice system should exist to deter people from committing crimes and to prevent dangerous criminals from committing crimes. Now, we have to change the way that we think about it, in the sense that if somebody were to murder my mother, philosophically, it seems odd to say, I really don't start a whole other discussion with this, but the best I can feel for that person is sorry for them. I have to feel sorry for that person. They're just a victim of their circumstance. They didn't choose to be in a psychological state and have been brought up in such an environment and have genetics that predispose them to committing this crime. They didn't choose any of that. It's not their fault. And now they have to go to jail because we have to prevent them from murdering other people, and we have to make sure that other people will be deterred from committing those crimes. But it's a tragedy that person has to go through the suffering of prison because they did something that they had no control over. But we do have to do it. But I think we need to see it in the light of, you committed this awful act. It's not because you deserve it. It's not because you deserve it that we're throwing you in jail. You deserve it in a sense of it's what must be done. It's your due. But it does need to change its outlook. Now, like I say, I could practically say the same. like in terms of the sentencing lengths and what crimes are sentenced and what they're sentenced for, and how much of a kind of insanity argument can come into it, whatever, like that may be able to stay all the same. But what needs to change is the justification. Again, like the ethical theory, the conclusions are just the same. That's the whole point of this, is that the ethical conclusions you can come to, don't murder, don't steal, you're being thrown in jail if you do this. Like, that can say exactly the same. The only thing that I'm trying to provide is the justification for that. The criminal justice system can say the same. The justification for putting people in jail needs to change.
Okay, Peter.
Thank you. Really engaging talk. I'm so glad I came. Thanks very much. There's half a dozen points on which I'd like to interrogate you further, but I'll just throw a couple up. Towards the end, you gave the example of a rape situation where you could say, if you saw the world as I do, then you would not do that. And that's kind of objective sort of statement. And I was imagining you saying that to Genghis Khan. And I can imagine him coming back with exactly the same retort. And if he had some sort of ability to see future, he would know that millions of people in Asia now carry his genes. So if his aim was to be genetically successful, then he would clearly say that factually your perspective was misguided. But that's just an aside. The thing I wanted to kind of share with you was, I got a sense that you were downplaying the value and role of habit in moral behaviour. Now, we know that one line of Aristotle's thinking was that you develop character. If you want people to behave in a moral way, then it's a process of character development. And that also connects in with training and with habit. So many of the actions that we do are performed out of habit. Now, you might say, well, I'm only talking about conscious actions. Nevertheless, we can consciously decide to cultivate a habit. And I think that's what Aristotle was talking about.
Yeah, right.
So is an habitual action that has been consciously prepared for through training, does that fall within your notion of a conscious action, or is it unconscious because you've trained it?
So there's an important distinction that needs to be made there. You say that like habitual actions can be said to be like out of our control because they're habitual. That's almost what it means by definition. But you can choose to cultivate the habit. Well, those are two separate things. There's the choice to cultivate the habit, and there's the enactment upon the habit itself. So Aristotle's point was that like by practicing virtuous behavior, you become virtuous. So the choice that you make is to start cultivating the virtues. Once those virtues become habitual for you, you aren't just a virtuous person. You don't need to cultivate that. You will just do it by habit. So when you cultivate a habit, that's a choice that you make in the traditional sense, if you know what I mean. And once it becomes the habit, then the enactment upon specific instances of the habit can be defined in terms of habit. So the conscious action part of that is instilling a habit, but the habit itself and the individual instances of the habit occurring are not conscious in a meaningful sense. If you see what I mean.
We could discuss it further in terms of human subsystems and so on, but thank you very much indeed.
But also just on Genghis Khan, like one of us is right, one of us is wrong. Like as a matter of fact.
We both have partial grasp of the actual.
Well, one of us is like either him doing that or him not doing that was going to maximize his pleasure. Like there is a fact about that, and one of us is right or wrong. Now, the point that I'm trying to make is that we don't have to actually know which of us is right or wrong to know that is a right answer. That's what I'm trying to do with the objective grounding.
If the world is fully captured with dichotomies, which it may not be.
Which may not be in the case of pleasure.
Okay.
It probably is. Yeah, that's something we can perhaps discuss.
Alex, one last quick question for me. Is this an original theory?
So it's I see it as an amalgamation of psychological utilitarianism and free will philosophy. These were two things that I was thinking about separately and in complete separate spheres. I spent a lot of time thinking about free will. It's obviously not my own. There's a long tradition of talking about free will with Hobbes and Hume and Bertrand Russell and Sam Harris, those people talked about, and engaged with that literature and became convinced free will doesn't exist. And that gave me a kind of moral existential panic. But separately from that, I was studying utilitarianism, and specifically Mill's version of utilitarianism, and I became fairly convinced of his arguments surrounding pleasure and hedonism in the psychological aspect. I didn't agree with him jumping the Azul divide, but I agreed with the psychological hedonism, the idea that you only desire pleasure. I just didn't put it together. That's all I'm really doing here. So it's not an original theory in the sense that the components have been endlessly discussed. But
okay.
I think
but
they just need to be put together and then to allow for a redefinition of terms like should in light of that. And I think that simple coming together is enough to completely change the way to think about it. That's what happened to me. I was brushing my teeth one day and I don't know what it was, suddenly I realized that these fit together.
Okay.
And I just sat down on the computer and started writing, and I've been writing for months and months and months since that original, like, hold on, you only desire what's pleasurable. You only do what you desire, and you only desire pleasure. It just suddenly just clicked. And it was just bringing them together. So it's original in a sense.
Okay, well, I'm going to call this new theory, this new conjunctive theory, Connerism. This was a unique event. You've heard it here, first of all, in Dorset Humanists. So will you please give Alex a really big round of applause?
I don't know. I think I agree with Hume more that like the Izok gap just doesn't really exist. That like experience, like I don't know about you, man, but I directly fucking experience. I know other people directly fucking experience and is and ought when they experience the pain. If you experience that they ought not to be in such a state, I experience that. So it's just kind of like, I experience my best friends as my in-groups ought not to be in such a state, unnecessarily. So it's just like, I experienced that as well, that I ought not to be in such a state necessarily. Like, I'm willing to go through pain to prevent a greater pain, but like, I don't know, it just seems completely ludicrous to say, like, yeah, there is no, like, aught you can get from experience. But obviously, yeah, people do. So, who knows? No, to me, it just seems that like logic fundamentally has like a flaw to it that like experience fills in. Like, we know gravity exists. We can't prove gravity exists with logic. We know the sun's going to come out tomorrow. We can't prove that it's going to come out tomorrow with logic. We just experience the fact that the universe is remaining constant. We know it's going to be the same. So it's just kind of like there's a lot of things that like experience proves and shows like directly that like I don't know, it doesn't seem to exactly be provable with logic. I don't fucking know. But yeah, that would just big chill. But I guess even under his viewpoint, given that we all have equal value, like $5 equal to your $5. I mean, if we only ought to do what causes, if we only do what causes us the most pleasure, I don't know if you. Basically, it sounds like if you ought to. What the fuck's do? You can see it the way I see it. You would see that maximizes your pleasure, or doesn't maximize. Hmm. It's just about trying to be logically, uh, not logically sound. It's just about trying to be correct. Yeah, no, but it kind of seems like it's saying you ought to be correct. I don't know. That just seems like weird. Like, who cares if you're correct or not correct? I don't know. It's basically saying you should do things that maximize your pleasure. Hmm. I just don't see it that way because it's like to me, it's like yeah, no, I don't know, man. I can imagine that Genghis Khan would have a maximum amount of pleasure by just being a sadistic motherfucker and pillaging. I can see that like a serial killer could get away with murder and just enjoy, like damn social contract, damn, he can probably get away with it. So it's just kind of like I don't know, like it seems to me that there's something more than that. Like it's more or less has to do with the direct experience. Like, and you can argue, I guess, yeah. I mean, like his perspective is. Fuck this goddamn useless mic. Testing 1 2. It's not useless. It's just shitty. Now let's put some music on. Let's start feeding. If it maximizes your pleasure, other people's experience is equal to your own, and their pleasure is equal to your own. Yeah, turn it, leave me the fuck up. I don't know, I'm guessing, I don't know, it seems like if you could say you should maximize your pleasure, like if Alex can say you should maximize your pleasure because you desire to maximize your pleasure. That it's not like, and that's like being inconsistent in that would be smelled bad or like silly or stupid. Like you shouldn't do it, basically. At the same time, you could say due to the fact that other people's value is equal to your own, it would be logically inconsistent to value their pleasure production any less than your own. I don't know, it seems like that makes sense to me. Like that's what I'm thinking. But I just like trying to think of a way to like make it not make sense, but it still makes sense to me. So it's like I don't know. It seems like experience driving value, or his theory of like I don't know. It still sounds like I mean it's basically. I don't know how you're not. I don't know how it's not crossing the S all. What the fuck? It's not crossing the S all because it's saying you is the case that it would be beneficial for you to maximize your pleasure. I guess that's true. It is the case. It is the case that would maximize your pleasure. And it is the case that their value is equal to your own. Therefore, it is the case. Nah, still it's an ought though. Therefore, it is the case. Therefore, it is the case, it would be equally beneficial to benefit yourself or them. As it is beneficial for yourself, it is beneficial to help them. I don't know. It seems like I'm saying a bunch of is's without crossing it ought. It sounds like I'm saying it is beneficial for you and it is beneficial for them. So therefore, I mean, so it is the case that you ought, but that you. So it is the case that we're producing equal value in each case. I don't know. There's no difference. And that all makes sense, yeah, but it's hard for me to, I just don't accept that. Like, it makes sense from, like, a pure, like, if you're going to go about arguing things, yeah, that's a good way to argue that people should, like, that seems like lying in a way, like, it's just trying to convince them, as I said, with, like, the Anton thing, like, of an arbitrary thing, like there's no baseline, no backbone. It's just kind of like, well, I feel this and you feel that, and it would maximize your pleasure, and I'm going to try to convince you it's going to maximize your pleasure to do that, and so therefore it will maximize your pleasure because you feel that way. And it just seems like it's like desire manipulation and stuff like that, and language manipulation. Like, to me, it just seems like, no, like, regardless of what, I don't know, man. It just seems like you're not really getting an ought from me. It's just like saying that, like, oh yeah, I mean, like, if you think it is desirable to feel pleasure, and it is desirable to avoid pain. Is it the case that other people's value is equal to your own? So it is beneficial to you to do things which maximize your pleasure and others' pleasure. Avoid the pain, such prevent pain for yourself, and avoid pain and prevent pain for others. And it checks out what completely logically. You can't really get, like, I mean, it's basically just saying, like, if you are to do actions, which are all actions, I mean, I guess, yeah, if everything is an action. Everything is an action, but all inactions in a way are actions. So, basically just showing that, like, yeah, like, I don't know, like, it's completely checks out, like, it's a moral system without an ought in a way, but it's like, it doesn't, I don't know, I feel like there are oughts, it just can't help but feel that there are oughts, like, you ought not to rape, that's not just the case that, like, oh, it is the case that rape would not be beneficial for me or something like that, because I mean, it's like, is the case it's not beneficial for someone else? Yes, by definition, but it's like it is not beneficial to me, therefore. Maybe it would work. Oh, but he's not saying it is the case you do what maximizes pleasure and minimizes pain. He's saying it is the case that you do what maximizes your pleasure and maximizes your pain and minimizes your pain. To be logically consistent, you are supposed to do what minimizes for you, not necessarily for everybody else. So I don't really like Alex's system. I feel like, yeah, intuition of that's why I've been feeling that. I'm trying to make his system work. I'm trying to like steelman his position and make it strong. But I don't fucking know, because like I agree that there's no free will, and I like agree that like a lot of the things he's saying. But then you start saying there's like no way you can cross in his off gap with experience, almost like that you need to start kind of just like teetering around all these other stuff. I'm like, that's all nice and stuff. It's cool. You can kind of do that in a way to like, and it's great for social contract stuff. But I feel like if you get like an actual psychopath, it's just kind of like, unless there's like an actual value in experience, it's just like, how am I supposed to convince a psychopath that it would be beneficial for him not to murder and rape someone in the countryside when he can totally get away with it and never feel shame from it, whatever. So it's just like, I don't know. It seems like, yeah, as Alex said, like someone is right in the case of Genghis Khan, like passing the genes on or whatever, and all that silly bullshit. In terms of Genghis Khan's pleasure. And I think, yeah, Genghis Khan probably got a lot of fucking pleasure from pillaging people. Probably more so if he would have sat on his boring ass just being like a farmer or something. So I think, yeah, in terms of Genghis Khan's experience, it was more beneficial for him to be a fucking warmonger. But in terms of the overall net experience, it was pretty shitty of him to do that. Rape people and cause negative experiences, and then force many generations into existence, consequentially speaking. So he did a bad thing. He did something that he ought not to have done because he was generating pain needlessly. You ought not to generate needless pain. You ought not to. I experienced that I should not experience pain unless I'm going through it to prevent a greater pain for myself. And given the fact that like other people's experience is equal to my own, it applies to them as well. So it's just like, I don't know. That's just how I look at it. I just mine does my explanation doesn't take an hour and a half. It takes like a couple seconds. It takes like a minute or two, and it fully encompasses like just like what I experience. I experience that it really fucking sucks to have pain, and that I ought to not go through it unnecessarily. That there's a reason to go through pain, then I can go through it. Otherwise, no. Fuck that. There's something viscerally wrong with the universe if I'm going through pain for not an unjustified reason. And given other people's experiences like my own, it's the same case for them. So I don't know. It just seems like I don't get this fear about crossing the is-ought gap. It's just like, it's like, who cares? It's like, what's the... I don't see the gap, and if there's some gap, I'm willing to fucking make believe, baby. I ain't no pussy. But that's just my thoughts.
Years ago, I went to Tel Aviv University to interview people about the Israeli-Palestinian situation. The students there from across the communities, including Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs, they approached a man in his late 30s and asked to film a short interview. He refused to be filmed or recorded, but agreed to speak off the record. I will call him Yusuf. Yusuf was doing his PhD in Islamic Studies at Tel Aviv University and lived inside Israel as an Israeli Arab Muslim citizen. And as of 2020,
Wow.
Arab Israeli citizens in Israel. I asked him why he did not want to be filmed, and he responded with his story, which has changed the way I see not just the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but the conflict to some degree. Yusuf spent his 20s wandering around cafes in Arab towns, suggesting to his brothers and sisters that it is not the Jews that are the enemy, it's the industrialists who are using the Jews and Arabs, gaming the situation to their advantage. After many years, he got a knock at his door. Two men who claimed that they were from the Israeli Secret Service warned him to stop, or he was going to be in big trouble. At course, he couldn't know if they were from the Secret Service or any other group, but he took the threat seriously and fled the country for several years. Since his return, he never speaks to his friends or family about this idea. So when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, one has to ask who benefits and how. I do not have enough information or knowledge to be able to answer that question in any meaningful way, but I can make some suggestions which help me avoid getting drawn into the arguments and the blame game. At the highest level, one could say that the system itself benefits, and most of us are entangled in that system, so most of us benefit from it too, without necessarily knowing it. The two obvious sectors of the military-industrial complex that benefit are the media and arms industries. The media, which is now on steroids, is built in with algorithms that create bubbles and echo chambers around any issue so as to keep users on a particular platform. The more juicy a conflict is, the more people get excited about taking sides, the more engagement on social media, and the more ad revenue. And of course, the more conflict, the more arms are sold. There are, of course, other people who benefit physically from conflict too, but the problem is that the majority of people who are currently taking sides and pointing the finger are themselves playing into the hands of the system by spending time on social media, which can often end up destroying them. Many of them, including myself, have pensions which are partially invested in every media and tech company and the arms companies. So the system, without any specific people, promotes the best circumstances for ongoing conflict by enabling the most corrupt people in any society to rise to the top and lead their respective people to hell. The very idea that profit is made out of arms, for example, is a crazy detail of the system and is bound to lead to huge amounts of violence. So when we get sucked into social media around this or any other conflict, we are playing our part in financing the war. For me, the best thing I can do is to limit my exposure to social media, so at least I am not financing these companies.
That's why your mission is sky, weather, rain, doofenshmirtz. We're breaking up. Let me tell you where the land lies. So, just to recap, sky, weather, rain, doofenshmirtz.
Time for draftphysics.com. Video presentation seen there on draftphysics.com. Also on debatephysics.com. 12 or 14 videos, 5 minutes long, going through all the different aspects of where the kinetic energy theorem, okay, which is sort of related to the working energy.
You know, I just can't see just like Alex's theory is like someone being raped in the universe. You know, I feel like the negative value is derived in their experience, and the odd is derived in the fact that they're having a negative experience, which can't be compensated by a positive experience or negative experience that they're preventing by, you know, causing it or whatever. So it's just kind of like, that's how I perceive the universe. He's perceiving it as like, no, the reason you shouldn't cause rape is because it's not beneficial for you. I don't know. I could just see it being beneficial for someone, and even if it wasn't beneficial for them, it just seems weird to say that like the reason you shouldn't rape is because it's not beneficial for you. It seems like no, it's because it's bad for someone else that you shouldn't rape. It's not because it's like, oh, it's just not beneficial for me. Ha ha ha. Me. No, it's more or less. It's like, yeah, sure. It's not the reason. The reason you're doing or not doing the rape is because it's beneficial / not beneficial for you. But that's not like the reason you ought to or ought not to. It's like, you know, like there are reasons you should do things, but the motivating factor is different than the reasons. I don't know.
Frankly, is
Anyways, I'm going to bed.